So thanks for coming out. Today I'm going to be teaching you about pollinator gardening for butterflies in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Um, so I'm here representing both the Edison Island Open Land Trust and the Carolina Butterfly Society, and I'm going to go through most of the slideshow pretty quickly. So don't feel like if you're here to learn about specific plants and that kind of stuff, don't feel like you have to write anything down. I have printouts of all the slides as well, so you can come up here and grab one of these after. Um, and yeah, so we've got a pretty small group, so just feel free to ask questions throughout, and I'll do my best to answer what I can. But technical difficulties. So who am I? I am a 12th generation Edistonian, native here to the low country of South Carolina. I have a bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries biology. I'm also work as a professional ecologist and conservationist down on Edisto Island in the low country. I'm an avid expert naturalist. I'm a published entomologist. I'm currently the president of the Butterfly Society, and I'm a guy who's built some pollinator gardens here in the low country over the last 8 years. And first things first, I guess let's start off with what a butterfly is exactly. So these are insects in the order Lepidoptera, specifically those in the superfamily Papilionidae. And these are pretty much diurnal moths with clubbed antennae. That's really what makes a butterfly from a biological sense. But we all have a good idea of what a butterfly actually is. Butterflies, as adults, they drink flower nectar. They have a coiled up proboscis that they use to sip nectar out of flowers. And their caterpillars eat plants. Each species has its own host plants that it's adapted to eating, and eventually caterpillars metamorphose into butterflies. And just a snapshot of butterfly diversity here in the South Carolina Lowcountry, we have over 130 species of native butterflies just here in the Tri-County area. And all of those butterflies are represented by 6 different families. The swallowtails, the sulfurs, the hairstreaks, the brushfoots, the skippers, and the metalmarks. And going into each one of those individually, swallowtails it's a fairly small group. We have about 6 species locally. There's 8 total in South Carolina. In the butterfly garden, they've got zebra swallowtails now, which are not really local here to the Lowcountry, but they're found all throughout sort of the upstate and the Midlands of South Carolina. But these are large to very large butterflies. They're spread-winged with kind of curved forewings. And they have a floaty gliding flight, and their namesake, the swallowtails, are these little projections you can see on the bottom of the wings. And those are there to distract predators, specifically birds, that kind of confuses them when they come in for the attack, and they'll take that little tip off the end of their wing, thinking that it's the head of the butterfly. And most of these species, they host on either trees or shrubs, with the exception of the black swallowtail, which hosts on a lot of garden herbs, things like cilantro, parsley, dill, carrots, that kind of thing, as well as many native plants in that same family. Additionally, we have the silvers and whites. These are kind of our next largest butterflies on average. We have about 14 species here locally, and about 9 that are reasonably common in the area. They're about a medium to small size, some ranging down to about 1 inch across, and others all the way up to about 3 inches. They're closed-winged. They generally have a round or triangular shape, and most of them host on either legumes or small herbs. We also have hair streaks. This is probably not necessarily our most diverse, but kind of our most varied group of butterflies. Some are very common, some are incredibly particular about the plants and habitats that they inhabit, and they kind of have the greatest diversity, I'd say, of colors out of any of our butterflies. These are small to very small butterflies. They're triangular in shape for the most part, and a little bit pointier than the sulfurs or whites. They're most often they're gray to brown, but we have ones, say, like this juniper hair streak, that are like a bright emerald green in color. And then additionally, from above, many of the males have really stunning blue iridescence. And over there in those pinned specimens that Gabe lent me, you can see the great purple hair streak and some others that have that really bright iridescent blue. You rarely get to see that, but when you do, it's just stunning to see. And these host on all manner of plants, things all the way from oak trees down to individual weeds in the garden. They have a wide variety of individual host plant preferences. Kind of the most diverse as far as appearance goes are our brushfoots. We have about 31 local species, and about 29 of those can be readily found here in the Tri-County area. They're very diverse in their size, shape, and color, as well as their behavior. And they range from small all the way to large butterflies, things from like this intricate satyr here, which is not even 1 inch across, all the way up to the monarchs that can be 4 foot or 4 inches in wingspan, not 4 foot. They can be open or closed wings. And an interesting quirk of the brushfoots, which gives them the name brushfoots, is that they have a specialized set of front legs, which they keep held up to their body like this, and they really just perch on four legs most of the time. They host on all manner of plants, and this group includes our monarchs, our satyrs, our fritillaries, our buckeyes, our snouts. The list goes on and on. There's lots of very distinct, unique butterflies in this group. And the next and our most diverse by far are the skippers. We have 58 species locally, and about 37 are reasonably common. There's a lot of very rare skippers out there that exist just in kind of micro ecosystems around all of South Carolina. And we have a lot that are found pretty much only in the Francis Marion in this area, just because of how rare and specialized they are. These range from medium-sized down to very small. They kind of have a wedge shape and profile. They look like a doorstop. They're triangular, and they have narrow triangular wings as well, which means that they're fast-flying, compact butterflies. So some of these, like say the Yucca giant skipper, which can be found on the beach, on barrier islands and beaches, and kind of further down south in the Lowcountry into the sandhills, those things can fly 60 miles an hour, which is just insane to think about for a butterfly. But larger ones like our Arcola skippers and our Brazilian skippers, they can pick up and book it at about 20 miles an hour. So these are fast butterflies. They don't act or look anything like our other butterflies, but they are butterflies. And these host on all manner of plants, especially grasses and legumes. There's a group within the skippers called the grass skippers, which host on just grasses. And many of these also just host on legumes as well. And so these are specialized to a lot of our kind of native herbs and plants all around the Lowcountry. Lastly, and least, is the little meadowlark, our only representative of the meadowlark family. And so these are uncommon to find. They show up in the Francis Marion with regularity, but out in the wide world of South Carolina, you usually don't see them very often. They're very small. They're rusty orange in color. They kind of have this black cobwebbing pattern. And then on the outside of their wings, they have a reflective silver patch. And these host on yellow thistles. That's our only representative. And so probably not something you're going to get in a butterfly garden, but they are out there. So now, in order to start talking about butterfly gardening, we have to talk about the life cycle of butterflies. And so each one of our species of butterfly has its own unique life history. Many of these are specialized to just one specific genus or group of host plants, and their caterpillars need to eat leaves. That's the only thing that the caterpillars are eating. Conversely, the adults only drink nectar, and so that's what they need to survive. And so if you want to build a butterfly garden and make it successful, you need to have both host plants and nectar plants in order to have it thrive and produce a bounty of butterflies and keep those butterflies year after year. And so with butterfly gardening, one thing I have to get out of the way on the front end, and I'm not going to sit up here and soapbox, is that insecticides are designed to kill insects that eat plants. Butterflies are insects that eat plants. So if you use systemic insecticides in your butterfly garden, you're not going to be able to keep butterflies in the garden. So if at all possible, you should refrain from using any insecticides in a butterfly garden, because you're more than likely just going to kill the butterflies that come to your garden. Additionally, herbicides, they're generally safe to use. The herbicides themselves, the actual active ingredients, are not going to hurt the butterflies themselves. However, many herbicides contain powerful detergents and surfactants in order to help them access or get dissolved into the plant. And so you should avoid, when possible, spraying these on host plants that are being eaten by butterfly caterpillars, or spraying the caterpillars directly, because it may kill them indirectly. And additionally, using herbicides is not all that great, because the weeds that are coming up in your garden might actually be valuable host plants or nectar plants for these native species. So that's my pitch for making room for weeds in your butterfly garden, is that many of the local weeds that we have that actively come up in butterfly gardens, whether you want them or not, are actually host plants for many of our native species. Things like frog fruit, sicklepod, toadflax, and cudweeds are all host plants for local species. The frog fruit hosts the phaon crescent and the white peacock. Sicklepod hosts sleepy oranges, cloudless sulfurs, little yellows, and gray hair streaks. Toadflax hosts the common buckeye. There's one up there eating a toadflax all the way down to a stick. And then over here, this is an American lady on a cudweed. And then additionally, many of the weeds that we get, whether we want them or not, are also great nectar plants. Things like poorjo is great for small butterflies. Field aster, which is also the host plant for the pearl crescent, is fantastic for a lot of smaller butterflies. Goldenrods are really good for a lot of our hair streaks, and they also help other native plants to establish by kind of creating an environment for those plants to take hold in by suppressing more non-native species. And additionally, thistles, although they're the worst thing in the world to step on, they are an absolutely exceptional nectar plant, as well as an exceptional pollinator or pollen plant for bees. And so if you can make room for thistles, then you're going to have a great garden. And just in brief, some general considerations for butterfly gardening is that you want to diversify your habitat. The more diverse conditions you have, the more plant variety that you're going to be able to support in your garden. And the more plant diversity you have, the more butterfly diversity you're going to have as a result. And additionally, let nature take its course. If a plant doesn't do well in your garden and it doesn't want to be in a specific spot, don't keep it there. Pick it up, move it somewhere else, find something that wants to be in that spot in your yard. Because the happier your plants are, the happier your butterflies are going to be. Additionally, if a plant does well, don't try and contain it, don't try and control it. Let it do its thing, let it spread, let it fill up, because the healthier that plant does and the more established of a clump that it's able to make, the better it's going to be able to do, the more vegetation it's going to be able to provide as a host plant, the more nectar it's going to be able to provide as a pollen plant and as a nectar plant. And additionally, let the plants meander. Let them go where they want to go. A lot of the annuals in here are really vigorous volunteers, and they don't want to volunteer right where they were. They want to spread out, kind of move around and bounce around in the garden. So don't contain them. Don't force them to stay in one pot. Let them move around. Let nature take its course. Let the garden be more of a habitat than a garden. And with that comes keep it messy. Allowing old vegetation, old dried leaves, old stems to stay in the garden promotes other beneficial insects that help the plants, which then in turn helps the butterflies. A lot of caterpillars will overwinter underneath leaf litter. Chrysalises are attached to dead stems of plants from the prior winter. So if you go in and clear out all the dead vegetation, you're taking all of your butterfly chrysalises for the next year and throwing them away. So you want to leave those in the garden until those butterflies emerge. This provides habitat for a lot of our native solitary bees as well, which pollinate the plants, which makes them better volunteers, makes them healthier. A lot of beneficial insects are able to make use of this other habitat, which then controls things like aphids and stink bugs and other pests that normally you would have to use insecticides to get rid of. So generally, the closer you can make it to a natural habitat, the better everything is going to be. And it also means less work you have to do because you're not out in the garden pulling weeds and breaking down sticks and throwing out mulch. Additionally, bridge the gaps. Consider the area in the neighborhood that you live in and what is lacking for butterflies in there. If you've got neighbors that have great ornamental nectar plants everywhere, but there's no host plants, focus on putting host plants in your yard because those butterflies are going to come in and use those host plants, and you're going to raise the population of butterflies in your area. At the same time, if there's a weedy field back behind your yard that's got plenty of host plants but no nectar, focus on planting nectar. If you don't have anything, do both. But think about what needs to be done in the area and what's going to have the most benefit to the butterflies. Because if you can do that, they're going to come to your yard and they're going to be more prolific. So you'll be able to look at them a lot more. And additionally, have fun with it. If you don't enjoy gardening, you're not going to go out there into the beating South Carolina sun and work in your garden. You're not going to keep it going. You're not going to maintain it. So do what you want to do. Do what you enjoy with the garden. But at the same time, try and provide what you can for the butterflies as well. But make sure you're having fun with it. Because if you're not doing it, you're not going to have a pollinator garden if you don't want to be out there. Additionally, I want to talk about native plants. Pound for pound, native plants are better for butterflies. Our native butterflies recognize these and they seek them out. They know what these plants look like and they know that they mean good nectar, that they mean host plants. And so they're going to come into your garden looking for them. They're going to see them and come in and lay their eggs or start nectaring or hone in on them. Additionally, native plants are just better for our native insects because many of them are adapted specifically to specialized plants. And again, the beneficial insects improve the plants and the plants then in turn provide for the butterflies. And most of our native plants are adapted to our local, well, they all are adapted to our local soils and our local climate. So they're going to do better with less care, less irrigation, less fertilizer, less mulch, less time that you have to spend trying to keep the plants alive and more time that you can appreciate and enjoy the garden. Additionally, many ornamental plants are rarely used by butterflies. The butterflies just don't know what they are, or they've been bred as an ornamental to not provide nectar or pollen because it makes them look prettier or makes them grow better. And so they're taking that energy away from what could be benefiting the butterflies and instead putting it into something that just makes it look better. And some are just terrible invasive species that could take over your yard or take over the garden, and you're not going to have room for these native plants. Or worse, escape into wild habitats and then cause further damage elsewhere. Additionally, on that note, the line between native and exotic plants can get blurry. Some plants are not native to South Carolina, but they are native to North America. And I'll be showing you some of those here today, but a lot of our migratory butterflies that have a large expansive range in the eastern United States or the southern United States or even down into the tropics, they know about these plants that are in Mexico, that are in the Caribbean and that kind of stuff. They're adapted to use them. They seek them out. They are able to utilize them, but they're not native to here in South Carolina. And so these are not things you should be putting into a natural ecosystem, but if you have them in a garden, they're actually good for butterflies because the butterflies are adapted to them even though they're not native here. Things like zinnias or Mexican sunflowers or Texas lantana. And I'll go over all of those. And so use your best judgment and consult online. Look up in the invasive species databases, and if it's an invasive species, don't plant it. But I'll have suggestions on everything up here. But what is and isn't native and what is beneficial and isn't beneficial is not always a hard cut and dry line in the sand. So the big thing you're going to be focusing on in a butterfly garden is nectar plants. And I promise I'll get to the pretty photos later, so just bear with me. It's front loaded on the text. So nectar plants are what attracts butterflies from the outside world into your garden. Nectar plants provide food for adult butterflies, and adult butterflies don't eat pollen and they don't eat vegetation. They just sip nectar. And fun fact, butterflies are not that great of pollinators. It's the everything else that's pretty much doing the pollination. And apart from a few specialized plants, most things are being pollinated by bees, wasps, or flies, as well as beetles. Butterflies are very good at coming into a flower and not getting any pollen on them because they don't want to have to deal with that. They're very good at just sipping nectar out. And so butterflies because of that, butterflies prefer plants that are colorful, that are broad, that are flat top. It's like a helipad that's just surrounded in cups of nectar that they can drink. That's why they really like things like zinnias and sunflowers. These are easy to see from the sky. They're easier for them to land on. They can just sit down and just drink their fill from one flower without having to bounce around the plants. Some ornamentals are also great nectar plants, and some are just never touched at all. So it's really hit or miss when you're not using native plants. And smaller butterflies, of course, prefer smaller flowers, and larger butterflies prefer larger flowers. Small butterflies don't want to have to compete with the big butterflies. At the same time, a lot of larger flowers they have flower tubes that are just too deep for small butterflies to be able to access. At the same time, big butterflies can't land on small flowers because they just fall over. And they have a hard time perching, they have a hard time drinking. It's a lot of work just to get a little bit of nectar. So having a variety of colors, of sizes, and of shapes helps promote butterfly diversity by providing flower types that are usable by all different species of butterfly. Yes, Gabe?
So I have noticed that a lot of the species here, one of the flowers seem to gravitate towards. Is there a reason?
I would say off top of my dome, it's because butterflies can see in the UV spectrum, and so white flowers are generally UV reflective. And so if you ever want to find out what flowers kind of look more like in UV, you can go out at night with a UV flashlight and shine, and if it's hyper UV reflective, then you know that that's what the butterflies are keying in on. Because sometimes you can look at a flower and it's just kind of boring and bland and the butterflies are hammering it. You shine it with UV light and it's just glowing like a kaleidoscope because it's got different UV reflective pigments in it that we can't distinguish, but the butterflies can see. And so these things are kind of just like neon billboards out there that are just reflecting sunlight out into the world, and that's what the butterflies are seeing, and that's what's drawing them in. So, and then host plants are the other side of the coin with butterfly gardening. So these are the nurseries that are going to raise new butterflies inside of your garden. These are what adult butterflies are going to be laying eggs on, and these eggs hatch into caterpillars, which then eat the host plant's leaves. And those caterpillars will then metamorphose the following year or maybe even that same season with some of our tropical migratory butterflies into new adult butterflies that are going to use your garden and hopefully continue to lay eggs within your garden. So a butterfly should ideally be able to complete its entire life cycle within your garden. It shouldn't have to leave to do anything else unless you've got access to good habitat nearby where you can focus on something else. But if you're an island in and of yourself, you want to provide everything that you can for a butterfly. This again will keep them there year after year after year. You'll be able to maintain the local population, or at the very least, you'll be able to catch tropical migrants as they come through and fall and have them there every year. And so If you have a certain particular butterfly that you just like seeing, try and make sure you have its whole life cycle available in your garden. And then that'll really motivate you to keep it going if you're able to keep that butterfly in there. So now we can get to the plants. And so the rest of the slideshow is pretty much recommendations on plants that I have found through trial and error work really well here in the Lowcountry of South Carolina for either attracting butterflies, providing host plants, or just being relatively low maintenance, even if they're not the best pollinator plant, where you're able to focus on some of the more important plants and have these as a cornerstone that you can rely on to always be there and always provide nectar. And so this is just an assemblage of some of the plants that I'm going to be showing you here in a second. The first one on here is muck sunflower. Pretty much all of our sunflowers are great, both the natives and the non-natives. The natives are good because they're perennial, they're very low maintenance. Annual sunflowers can be a real pain to get going sometimes, but with our native sunflowers, they're pretty much all perennials. Muck sunflower is a semi-native from the Gulf Coast. This is not native to South Carolina, but it is native to the deep south. It's not invasive. It does kind of fill in on roadsides and other disturbed areas, but it's not an invader into the natural world. And this is just a fantastic nectar and pollen plant on really good soil. This thing will get 10 foot tall, and it likes wet soils, and it will really fill in an area and just kind of make it its own. So if you can get this thing going, if you're on a wetter soil, one of these flat, like I know a lot of Somerville is like this, if you can get this thing going in an old pot or an old tire or something, someplace where you can keep it more or less contained, it is a fantastic plant, and it can really spruce up a yard. Another one is dense blazing star. This likes drier sites. Our butterflies love this. It's a very small, compact plant. You can usually get these from big box stores. And a quick point back on the muck sunflower. This is often labeled as narrowleaf sunflower in a lot of our local native plant nurseries. That is not narrowleaf sunflower. That is this. This is muck sunflower. Narrowleaf is a very kind of stringy plant that gets about this big. It kind of grows in wet areas around the low country. This is muck sunflower. It's from the Mississippi Delta. It gets huge. But anyway, you can often get this in a lot of big box stores. In the ornamental varieties as well as the native ecotypes, they both do really good in gardens, and they're both enjoyed by pretty much all of our pollinators. And again, it's a very compact plant. It's very drought tolerant. It's easy to grow if you have the right soil. It doesn't take up a lot of room. It's pretty much just a little brush that comes up out the ground. Frostweed, this is another big, aggressive spreading clumping plant. This one makes a good liner to the side of a fence or something like that, where you want to kind of create a screen, or you have kind of a shady area that's not the best place to put other things. This one works great. This is another perennial. It's really good with nectar. It's also really good with pollen. And again, it gets about chest to head height. Hairy leafcup. This is a really big bushy one. This is one that you want to just kind of keep in its own place. If you have a corner somewhere, a shaded area of the yard where you can't really do much with, you can stick this one over here in that area and let it just kind of fill up and take over. It also provides a lot of structure for wildlife habitat and that kind of thing. But it's a very big plant. But again, another great nectar plant, another great pollinator plant. And it's a good one for partially shaded areas. Obedient plant, this is another one you can get fairly regularly from native plant nurseries. It prefers wetter sites, and it's used by a lot of pollinators, both bees and butterflies. And it's one of those ones that if you get it going, it's very easy to grow. Elliott Saster, this one is a fantastic plant for both bees and butterflies, and it really likes a wet soil. It grows as a perennial. It kind of spreads out into kind of like a low hedge on really good soils. Get a drink of water. And it is also the host plant for our pearl crescent. But I've managed sites where there has been like kind of small fields planted with this stuff, and it is just insane the number of pollinators that come in and key in on it. But it really needs a wet site. But if you get it in the right place, it does spread aggressively. So this is one of those ones that you want to keep contained if you're trying to keep stuff in set areas. But if you've got a wet meadow, you can usually get this stuff in there and let it just go on its own, and it'll create its own little micro habitat. Spotted bee balm. This is a fantastic one for dry, droughty soils, especially kind of poor, sandy soils. It'll grow most anywhere, so long as it's well drained. It has this really cool, complex, multi-tiered flower. It's not the best for butterfly nectar, but it is just fantastic for all of our native pollinators. And a few of our butterflies will use it, things like monarchs and other larger butterflies. And it's easy to grow. It's clump forming. It's easy to divide, and it's one of the very few things that will grow on our poorest, driest sites out here. Black-eyed Susan is another one. You can get both ornamental varieties and wild types. Goldstrom is a similar species in the same genus that also does really well. And again, these will also tolerate drier sites when in shade. And they're not the best nectar plant, but they are pretty good for pollen. And they look pretty. They're easy to grow. They're very reliable. They're a consistent annual that volunteers with self-seeding. And Guardia is another one that's in a similar bucket. Not that great as far as supplying nectar, but they'll grow on practically any dry soil. They'll even grow in street beach sand. And they provide nectar in places where nothing else will grow. And they're very easy to grow. And if you have them sort of down in the more subtropical areas around the barrier islands, the stuff will grow as a perennial. It's really weird. It just kind of stops paying attention to the season and just kind of keeps flowering and growing and dying at random times. But it's another really good, consistent one that will grow on our poor, dry soils where not much else will. Lanceleaf coreopsis is one that's kind of works anywhere. It'll grow on wet sites. It'll grow on dry sites. It's a very consistent self-seeder, and it's also a perennial. So this is a good one to put in pretty much any garden. Golden Maiden coreopsis. This is another semi-native from the Gulf Coast. It is an annual, unlike most of our other tick seeds. It does well on kind of moist, sandy soils, kind of sea island sand barrens on margins and stuff. It grows really well on roadsides and medians and stuff. So this is one that has a niche where you can put it in kind of places where that are highly disturbed, that have, not too much else you can get in there, where there's a risk of stuff being killed or turned up, seasonally, that kind of thing. It's a good one to provide a lot of color, but it's not the best pollen or nectar plant. Common self-heal, on the other hand, is a fantastic nectar plant. It's kind of difficult here to grow in the South Carolina Lowcountry. You really have to have a well-selected, partially shaded, moist site. Stuff is very prolific in the Midlands and the Upstate. Down here on the coast, it usually gets a little too hot, so if it's not in a sheltered area, it'll get burnt by the summer sun, but it'll do really well in spring. It'll do really well in fall. Practically all of our native butterflies key in on this stuff, and we'll select it over most other plants. It's also a very small, compact plant, so you can put this in a shaded area. It kind of only grows about 6 inches to a foot in height. You can use it to fill around the base of a tree or something like that. New York ironweed. This is one that's great for wetter sites. It's a very tall plant, but it's also not that broad. It kind of stays, compact, about the size of this podium. It doesn't really spread all that aggressively, but it's one of those ones that's preferentially selected by a lot of our native pollinators and butterflies, and it will grow on very wet soils. It'll grow in kind of more saturated soils, and it'll also grow in slightly drier sites as well. Lyre-leaf sage. This is a good ground cover. It's a good component of a turf grass alternative lawn as well. It kind of just has a flat rosette of leaves that kind of just looks like a tea saucer on the ground for most of the year. It puts up a little 12-inch tall flower spike. It's got these pretty pale blue flowers, and if it's on a good site, it can become very prolific and it can fill in a whole area. And so this is one that can be grown, say, like under live oaks or some other area on drier, well-drained soils, without having to get anything that's too aggressive. It's a perennial, but it's also a self-seeder. It kind of just creates a cover right over the surface of the ground. And it's an okay nectar plant. It's preferentially selected by some of our native bees, but not the greatest for the butterflies. Blue mistflower is a really good nectar plant. This is one of the few plants that'll grow in kind of forested wetland margins. It'll grow in partial shade. It'll grow in damp soil. It'll grow in drier soils. This one really likes to be on the edges of woods, the edges of things. This is one that you can line a fence with or put on the corner of a house somewhere where it only gets partial sun. And butterflies really like this stuff. They'll key right in on it. If you get it in the right site, it's pretty much self-sufficient. It spreads as well. It can be easily divided. It's a good one on the right soils. Yellow thistle. This is the last thing you want to step on barefoot when you're not expecting it. But at the same time, these ugly, bristly things are absolutely stellar nectar plants as well as pollen plants. Bumblebees and a lot of our swallowtails will key in on this stuff preferentially over everything else. And again, it's the host plant for the little metal mark. So if you're somewhere around the Francis Marion, you might be able to get metal marks if you leave these things around. And they do tolerate some partial shade, and they generally flower in early spring. So they're a short-lived perennial. They can live a couple of years, but usually they're more or less an annual. So these are ones that you kind of have to have a special place to keep them in. And mountain mints, everything loves mountain mints. They're good in partial shade. They don't really like wet soils all too much, but sort of upland sites that are bit shaded, forest edges, that kind of thing. These things do phenomenally. You see butterflies on this that you don't see on other things, and they're just always loaded with pollinators. So if you can find a place for this, this is a great one to do. And then I also wanted to touch on some of the ornamental plants that we have that also are a benefit for pollinators. And just real quick, I have 4 on here that I don't have slides for that I wanted to touch on. Plumbagos are they're a host plant for the Cassius blue butterfly, and they're also a pretty good nectar plant. And you can get these at pretty much any big box store. And on the woody side, we don't have all too many shrubs that are really good for pollinators that are native. Some of the less aggressive ornamental ones include chase tree, vitex, which is usually pretty good. They don't tend to spread or be invasive. Bottlebrush, here in the Lowcountry, these do really well. They're also really good for hummingbirds. And then butterfly bush with an asterisk. This can be invasive in the Midlands and the upstate, but here in the Lowcountry, they tend not to spread. They're not able to compete with our native Lowcountry flora, but don't plant this northward into the Piedmont and stuff because it can escape and get out into natural areas, especially in the Midwest, New England kind of area. But here in the deep south, it's usually not an issue, and it does provide some benefit if you can't get anything else to grow or that you're not able to find. I would recommend chase tree over butterfly bush personally, but those chase trees can get very big. So if you're more size limited, butterfly bush is usually a better bet for a smaller hedge. So to start off with, for ornamentals, yarrow. This is actually a cosmopolitan species. It is found globally. It's a very interesting complex. I won't get deep into it, but we do have some native varieties. For pollinators, you're going to want to go with more of a traditional older heirloom type because those haven't been bred for max, flower appearance, and they still produce a lot of nectar and they still produce a lot of pollen. These are very hard to kill. They'll grow just about anywhere. They're a decent nectar plant for our smaller pollinators. Zinnias, these are a mainstay of many pollinator gardens because they are just so sought after by our tropical migrants. So this is a native to Mexico, and a lot of our tropical migratory butterflies live in Mexico. They are adapted to find this plant and feed on this plant. And so this is an ornamental that is a fantastic nectar plant. It has no invasive capabilities here. It's just an annual, but if you can get it growing, stuff will use it, and they will use it over everything else. And additionally, you want to go for varieties that have a central disc. You don't want to get the ones that's all just petals. You want the ones with kind of the little yellow center, the landing pad, because those disc flowers in the middle, the tiny ones, are what the actual butterflies are after. They're not really interested in the big petal flowers. And these are compound flowers, so they're made of hundreds of smaller flowers all assembled together. Mexican sunflowers, similar story. These are from Mexico. A lot of our tropical migratory butterflies are very well adapted to these, and they seek them out. Easy to grow, not invasive, need full sun. These are kind of second. These are bigger. These fill up more room than zinnias do, but they do well in certain sites where zinnias may not. Leeks. This is a common vegetable in gardens, and it's also a fantastic pollinator plant. They do really well in a wide variety of soils, but they kind of like rich, damp soils the most. And they're pretty much carefree. You can just let them grow as a perennial, and they will produce a flower every year in mid-spring that a lot of butterflies really like, more so than our onions. And so this is a good one to put in your pollinator garden because even if the butterflies don't use it, you have free leeks that you get to eat. Sages, there's a ton of sages. We have a lot of native sages, like the lyre leaf sage I showed, and then we also have scads of non-native exotic sages. And for the most part, these are all good for our larger butterflies, especially things like cloudless sulfurs. I seem to really like them. And so there's a variety of sage that'll fit whatever need you have in your garden. and a lot of these will provide pollinator benefit to butterflies. Vervains, these are an interesting one. I wouldn't recommend planting vervains, but you will get a vervain that will come up in your garden because they're an established exotic here in South Carolina. And so if you do get a vervain in your garden, I would give it some time and see if it provides benefit and stuff using it. And if it is, let it stay. And if not, pull it up. But these grow practically anywhere. These will grow on really terrible, poor soils. They'll grow in really hot urban areas as well. I'm thinking of things like our purple top vervains and tuberous vervains and that kind of thing. These are very tolerant of poor site conditions, but at the same time, they provide a lot of nectar. These are sought after by many of our butterfly species. And so in areas where there's nothing else growing, this is the only thing producing nectar because it's the only thing that'll grow. So this is one of those, if you don't have anything better, these will get you by. But again, wouldn't recommend planting them directly. Texas lantana, this is a semi-native. This is from the Southwest in Texas. And this is just an absolutely unparalleled nectar plant. Especially our tropical species, but as well as many of our native species, even things like grass skippers, key in on this over everything else. If you can get it in the ground, butterflies will come and they will use it. If you can't grow anything else, you can grow Texas lantana. And this is not the same as common lantana, which has invasive capacity. You can see those, like if you go down to Fort Moultrie, they're kind of taking over that dune back in there. This is not as aggressive, but it is just as prolific in its flowers. And these can be evergreen in the right habitats, but they're a low maintenance perennial, and they just produce a ton of nectar, and they're incredibly attractive to butterflies. Abelias are a non-native shrub that is also very good for a lot of our larger butterflies as well as our bees, surprisingly, and it's a very low maintenance plant, and it likes hot, dry, terrible soil. So this is one that can be done in an urban area or in a poor site where it will provide benefit where you might not be able to get something else established. And then to get into a few of our common host plants, we've got our milkweeds, which is for our monarchs. We have sicklepod for sleepy oranges, passionflower for Gulf fritillary, field aster for pearl crescents, rabbit tobacco for American lady, partridge pea for cloudless sulfurs, and St. Augustine grass for Carolina satyrs and others. And I'll go over these in detail, but this is just a selection of native plants that are providing caterpillar food for a ton of our native butterflies. And these are all pretty much common weeds that can be found in most old fields or most disturbed sites. And additionally, a lot of exotic plants are also suitable host plants. Things like dill is a host plant for the black swallowtail. They host on one specific family of plants, which includes a lot of herbs, things like dill, parsley, cilantro, that kind of stuff. Garden beans are native to Central America, and so is the long-tailed skipper. So this is actually a natural host of theirs, which is not native here. And then again, this is one you can grow, and then you get free beans, even if you don't get butterflies. Cannas, the golden canna is native to Florida. So is another plant I'll be showing you here in a minute. But the canna lily from South America will also host one of our native butterfly species, the Brazilian skipper. Plumbagos, there's one native plumbago in Florida, which is the host for Cassius blue, but they will also use exotic plumbagos when planted in gardens. Citrus trees are host plants for our giant swallowtail, and cole crops are host plant for the cabbage white. And I believe the cabbage white is actually from Europe, but it is established in gardens. But if you're already growing things like broccoli or collards or cabbage, you can have cabbage whites in your garden as well, just by having those plants around. And so butterfly weed is kind of the go-to native milkweed here in the Lowcountry. It does really well on upland well-drained soils. People will tell you cannot grow this in a pot. That is false. That is incorrect. I've grown a lot in pots. They do much better in the pots than in the terrible soil I have. But these are fantastic plants for butterflies. It's very attractive and is the host plant for our monarch. Sicklepod, this one is native-ish. It's another one of those cosmopolitan species. They don't know when it got here, but it's been here for hundreds of years. But it's also the host plant for about 3 or 4 of our native butterflies, and I've just got the 2 main ones, the cloud sulfur and the sleepy orange here. This is a common weed in a lot of farm fields and old fields, but it is also a host plant, and it does provide decent nectar for bees, or pollen for bees, and okay nectar for butterflies. Purple passionflower, this has an absolutely unparalleled, exceptionally complex flower here. It's a great pollen plant for bees, and it's also a good nectar plant. This is the host plant for all of our native fritillary butterflies, the Gulf fritillary, the variegated fritillary, as well as the zebra longwing when it's in a more shaded site. Zebra longwings will eat it, they just don't like being in the full sun. So you don't usually get this in shade. So sometimes they'll use it, sometimes they won't. Field aster is another one. This is a common weed in a lot of areas of South Carolina, but it's also the host plant for our pearl crescent, as well as many of our small butterflies utilize this as well for nectar. Rabbit tobacco is another common weed. Doesn't really provide much nectar or pollen, but it is the host plant for our American lady, and it's the prettier of our cud weeds. It's the larger one, and it kind of smells like maple syrup sometimes as well, which is a slight benefit. Partridge pea, this is another native plant. This provides great wildlife habitat if you can grow it in a field setting, but it's also the host plant for at least 4 of our native butterflies. And it is also a great pollen plant for bumblebees. St. Augustine grass is another native-ish one. The first time this was ever described by science was out of Charleston, South Carolina, but they're not certain where it actually came from. They think it may have floated over from West Africa hundreds of years ago, or it may have been brought with the earliest colonists accidentally. But it's been here for hundreds of years, and it is used by probably a dozen different native species. Yes, Gabe? It is definitely naturalized, but it's pretty aggressive in certain situations. So the question is, did it make it here on its own, or did we bring it? Because it's here and it's doing well. And the first time anyone ever really looked at it in earnest was, well, 250 years ago in Charleston. So we don't know. It may be here by its own volition, or we may have brought it. It's naturalized. It's a gray area. Going into the ornamentals, we have dill. It's always good to have dill in the garden for making deviled eggs and whatnot, and it's great for black swallowtails. So this is, I found to be their preferred host plant in a garden setting, has been dill. They don't really like parsley or cilantro all that much if dill is available. And dill is also a fantastic nectar and pollen plant as well for a lot of our native pollinators. Garden beans, these are a host plant for a long-tailed skipper. They do also use several other native vines, but if you're planning on doing pole beans or bush beans, you can also expect to have long-tailed skippers show up in summer. And this will provide a host plant habitat for them. Golden cannas, this is our native canna from Florida. There's a few isolated native populations here in South Carolina, but they are common to get out of big box stores and that kind of stuff. They don't really spread, they're not aggressive, and they are the host plant for a Brazilian skipper. They're also a pretty good pollen and nectar plant as well. And then I'm just got some slides here on general considerations for specific types of sites. So for wetland sites, of the ones I've shown previously, muck sunflower, obedient plant, New York ironweed, and golden canna are all great options for this, as well as Elliott's aster. Then additionally, we have powdery alligator flag, climbing aster, pickerelweed, aquatic milkweed, and Virginia iris, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail. So powdery alligator flag is a really big wetland plant. This is a rare native plant here in South Carolina, but despite that, in its kind of specialized growth conditions, it is incredibly hardy, and it does very well as a nursery plant. So this stuff is grown and sold extensively, but it's native to right here in South Carolina. In fact, where I work down on Edisto Island, it is probably one of the largest strongholds of the plant in the Lowcountry, because it is in all of the natural wetlands out there. But this is the host plant for our Brazilian skipper, and it does provide nectar to a lot of our smaller wetland butterflies as well. Climbing aster, this is generally found in kind of shaded, low wetland saturated soil areas. But this is a low growing vine with aster flowers on it, and it is a fantastic nectar and pollen plant. And so, this needs structure to grow on. It is a vine. But it's quite prolific, and it does quite well in a variety of settings. But in the wild, I typically find it in wetlands. Pickerelweed, this pretty much needs standing water to grow. But if you have like a pond or a small wetland garden, if you get that in there, you will get butterflies on it, because it is a phenomenal nectar and pollen plant for both bees and butterflies. And it will fill up a shallow pond as well. So this is a great way to kind of keep duckweed out of a pond and that kind of thing if you want something else in there. Aquatic milkweed. This is the primary native milkweed host that we have here in the Lowcountry, in addition to butterfly weed. But this, in the inverse, rather than being found on the highest, driest sandhills is found in the wettest, soupiest bottomlands. And this is actually the primary host plant of our local population of non-migratory monarchs. If you didn't know, we have a population of monarchs here in South Carolina that does not migrate. They lay eggs on aquatic milkweed in the bottomland forests, as well as some eventually venture out and lay eggs on butterfly weed in the uplands. But these butterflies travel down to the barrier islands here on our coast, overwinter there, and then head back to the swamps in the spring. And so we have a small population that just stays in the low country of South Carolina, which DNR researchers were able to tell and just published about last year. But if you've got a wetland site, aquatic milkweed is the milkweed for you because this stuff grows pretty much in muck. Yes, Gabe?
Is that the same thing as swamp milkweed?
No, swamp milkweed is something different. That's a taller one with pink flowers. They don't like the brutal beating heat as much. So they don't grow in quite as wet soils, and they don't really like how hot it is here. But I know some folks who've had some great success with it. I have just not, because I live on a sand hill, which helped. So Virginia iris, this is another one, very easy to grow. You can pretty much just throw a corm or a rhizome in the ground, and they'll just take over. This likes growing on pond edges, and we have a lot of our native butterflies that are really specialized to use this plant. They really like it. They really key in on it, as well as large butterflies, as well as bumblebees also enjoy it quite a lot. And again, super easy to grow. It'll fill in a sort of wet, shallow area or a pond edge really nicely. Really nice, pretty foliage as well. And then on the complete inverse, I've got recommendations for sand ridge sites. So this is where my house is. So this is what I've put the most time and thought into. And these are the plants that do really well on our worst soils. The ones I've shown already, butterfly weed, Indian blanket, and spotted bee balm, as well as sensitive partridge pea, elegant blazing star, camphor weed, woodbine, poorjoe, narrowleaf silkgrass, and sand myrtle, potentially, which I'm working on. I'm trying to see if I can figure out a way to get that established. But sensitive partridge pea, this is a native kind of to our sandhill ecosystems. It's kind of the baby brother of partridge pea. It's much smaller, much more compact, much smaller flower, but it provides host plants acts as a host plant for pretty much all of the same butterflies as regular partridge pea, but it's well adapted to the sand barrens of South Carolina. Elegant blazing star is the blazing star that is best adapted to our droughty, nutrient-poor sandy soils. And again, this is a compact bulb, so it doesn't take up a lot of room. It's kind of just one brushy spike. Camphor weed, this stuff will grow will grow in beach sand in secondary dune ecosystems, and it'll grow on poor, dry, sandy soils as well. Not the best nectar plant, but cut it some slack, it's grown in terrible soil. But it will do well, but it is kind of a large, leggy bush. It likes to fall over. It doesn't have a lot of structure to it, but it'll grow and it'll compete in hayfields as well on these sandy sites. Coral honeysuckle, this is a fantastic nectar plant for large butterflies as well as bees and hummingbirds. This grows on sandy upland soils. It'll grow in full sun. It'll grow in part shade. You can put it on a house. You can grow it like a bush. You can put it on a fence. You can put this stuff practically anywhere and it'll do well. But it is a large vine and it does like to spread. But at the same time, it also has evergreen flowers. So this can act as a shade plant. You can use it in a trellis or a pergola, that kind of thing. There's a lot of flexibility with it. Poorjoe, this is a native weed that just comes up, is naturally found in these sandy, dry upland soils, these really drought-prone soils. And it's not the most pleasant thing to look at, but it is also a great nectar plant, especially for small butterflies. A lot of them key in on this, and if you let it go, it's usually the only thing blooming, mid-July, June, that kind of thing. And so it's a key nectar plant to fill in these gaps when the other plants are struggling just to stay alive. Narrowleaf silkgrass, this is another great lawn alternative, except for the fact that it puts up these large, 2 to 3 foot tall flower spikes. Well, I guess more like 1.5 to 2.5 foot flower spikes. Has some fairly pretty yellow flowers on it, but for the most part, it kind of looks like a silvery, grassy ground cover for most of its life. And it does really well on our drier soils. It'll grow in practically the driest, sandiest soils, and it'll kind of form its own little carpet. It's an all right nectar plant. It's a little bit better of a pollinator or a pollen plant than a nectar plant. Sand myrtle. This one is a very rare, specialized native to South Carolina. but it has a really interesting specialization of the soil it uses. It likes moist, nutrient-poor, sandy soil that is covered in pine straw, which is a lot of the urban flower beds scattered around houses and other commercial buildings in the Lowcountry. And so this is actually a really good native alternative that might be able to tolerate those absolutely terrible sites that are around a lot of commercial buildings and other such stuff. So this is native to kind of the sand barrens of the sandhills regions, kind of moist swales in the middle of the sandhills, areas along creeks and that kind of stuff that just has a higher water table, but it grows in some of the worst soil in South Carolina. But it is also a fantastic nectar plant, and a lot of really rare butterflies use it because those rare butterflies are found in these rare ecosystems. And things like this Hessel's hair streak here, which is just an incredible butterfly to get eyes on. Things like great purple hair streaks and other stuff. So this one, you can get these from some specialty stores, and they have the capacity to do really well in some very specific urban ecosystems if they can get good cultivars going. And then for shaded areas, we've got, and I won't read all of these again, but I have several ones in here, but really the only three new ones are this yellow passion flower, snowy square stem, and elephant's foot down here. So yellow passion flower is this is the host plant for our zebra longwing butterfly. Those are more of a tropical species. They kind of come up here in towards the end of fall. It depends on how good of a year they have down in Florida, whether or not they make it up here. But if we have a mild winter, they will persist. And this is the host plant they utilize. So this is kind of the little brother of the purple passion flower. This grows in shaded areas. It's got handsome foliage on it, but the flower is nowhere near as large and impressive. It's not that great for butterflies, but it is the host plant for the zebra longwing. So if you get zebra longwings where you are, this is how you're going to keep them around. It will host gopher fritillaries and variegated fritillaries when those are found, or when this starts to grow in sunnier habitats. Snow square stem is found really just native only here to the Sea Islands of South Carolina and a little bit, more inland down towards the Georgia line. But this is a favorite nectar plant of zebra longwings. So not a lot of people know about this because its range is so limited, but this is a very shade-tolerant nectar plant that likes to grow in kind of roadside ditches and that kind of thing all around the Sea Islands. And it is fantastic for zebra longwings and other things like clouded skippers, other butterflies that like to stay in the shade. Hairy elephant's foot, this is very similar to lyre-leaf sage in that it's kind of a ground cover lawn alternative, but it works really well in a lawn setting underneath live oaks and that kind of stuff. It has a small little flower on about a 12-inch flower stalk, and butterflies absolutely love this stuff. And I'm talking from the tiniest little Serranus blues that are like the size of a pinky nail all the way up to giant swallowtails that are like two hands together. And this is just a tiny little half-inch size flower, and they go after this stuff. So this is a generally a common weed in forested environments, and you can propagate it and get it to go. It is a really great nectar plant come late fall. And then for urban sites, there's more special considerations. You have to think about really high heat, really low soil fertility, compacted soil, that kind of stuff. And so these are the few things that I know of that will tolerate urban sites well. Some of these we've already talked about, and some of these are brand new. But Indian Blanket and Black-Eyed Susan generally tend to do really well, but they are annuals, so you have to keep up and replant them every year if you're doing this in sort of an urban area somewhere. But frog fruit is one that's very interesting because this is the closest thing that we have to a turf grass alternative in a pollinator plant. So these will grow and spread and form a mat just like a grass will, but they like wet, sandy soils, and they can tolerate some of the harshest environments. They've done experiments up at USC in Columbia where they've had them grow on asphalt almost in like the middle of downtown Columbia. I tend to see them down here more in kind of like in coastal environments on the margins of, say, brackish ponds or the margins of wetlands, but you can get this stuff established in pretty much any environment so long as it has enough moisture. It's a fantastic nectar plant, especially for small butterflies, and it's also the host plant for the Phaon crescent and the white peacock, which are both more subtropical species further down the coast, but they do come up here every now and again, and we do have populations of Phaon crescents on the coast. So tuberous vervain, this is a non-native species. This is bordering on invasive. It's not really invasive here, but it is in other places. But this is a small perennial. It forms a tuber, only gets about 12 inches tall, but it does have an attractive flower, and it will tolerate a ton of abuse. And it's also a decent nectar plant. Again, these recommendations are for the South Carolina Lowcountry. Don't apply this elsewhere in the country. But tuberous vervains, I've not noticed them to be particularly aggressive here in South Carolina, and they do really well on some of the worst sites. And so they will help fill in gaps where you're not able to get other things established, especially in places like urban areas where there's not really that much of a risk for spread because there's just not that habitat they can get into in the area. White beggar sticks are one that are a great pollinator plant. These are native to Central America, so a lot of our tropical butterflies are really well adapted to this. They really key in on it, but this stuff is aggressive and it will spread. I would not recommend planting this anywhere near a natural area in the deep low country. In an urban setting or further up inland, it's not able to really persist as aggressively. But I have seen this stuff spread into natural areas down on the coast on Edisto Island. So this is a plant with caution. This plant is very good at getting out of cultivation. It's an annual, but it has seeds that stick to everything. They stick to rats, stick to squirrels, stick to raccoons, stick to dogs, stick to your pant legs, anything that brushes by them. So these can jump out and get into a natural area easily. So plant this if you know it's not going to get out. Otherwise, maybe not. Additionally, I have to talk about tropical milkweed. This is a native to Central America, and this is an evergreen milkweed, and it is by a mile the easiest milkweed to grow, and it tolerates really poor soils. And so there's nothing wrong with tropical milkweed. What's wrong with tropical milkweed is what lives on it. So this is a host plant for our monarch butterfly. All of our native milkweeds are perennials that die back in the winter and then regenerate in spring. If tropical milkweed is grown close to the coast, it does not die back in spring. It just grows until it freezes. And so if it has evergreen foliage, that foliage is able to persist for multiple years, and it can build up concentrations of bacteria and other diseases on it, which then can harm monarch caterpillars when they're laid on there, specifically the OE parasite that causes monarch wings to become deformed and malformed. So additionally, there's issues with migratory monarchs laying eggs on this in late fall, because normally when they come through on migration, there's no milkweed, but then they lay eggs at the end of the season, and those caterpillars freeze or they get this bacteria, and so you're losing part of that generation of monarchs that's supposed to be migrating to Florida and Mexico. And so the simple solution is that if you need to use tropical milkweed in the garden, you cut it back at the middle of September, put a little bit of mulch on it, you put a pot over it, and then you wait until New Year's and you kick the pot off, and then it's fine. So the problem is the evergreen foliage. It's not the plant itself. The plant is not invasive. The plant is not killing the butterflies. There are parasites that live on it, and the butterflies are also using it at the wrong time of year. So as long as if you're able to keep up with this and manage it, it's a fine plant to have in a butterfly garden. But if you're putting this in a more wild setting, an unmaintained setting, don't use it because it can harm the monarch population, specifically the migratory population. Then with that, the last consideration is where are you going to get all these plants? And so you can get potted plants and plugs from the South Carolina Native Plant Society. They have native plant sales twice a year. See, they used to do it at Charlestown Landing. I think they're doing it someplace else now. But they hold a hold a sale every spring and every fall. Additionally, we have several local nurseries. There are a lot more local nurseries selling native plants nowadays. I can recommend Roots and Shoots, Bottle Tree Gardening, and Native Plants to the People. And there are others all throughout the South Carolina Lowcountry providing native plants now. Then seeds, you can get some of these native plants from big box stores. However, you're probably going to have to go online to find a lot of the more specialty stuff, but there are more and more plant nurseries selling native seeds. You want to try and get seeds from your local region. You don't want to, say, get seeds for a plant that grows here from the Midwest or something like, say, partridge pea. If you get Midwestern partridge pea, the thing gets this big. If you get the local ecotype, it only gets this big. So you want to try and source the seeds locally if possible. And so you can collect seeds yourself. With permission, you can collect them from gardens or natural areas or roadside ditches or along roads, that kind of stuff. And you can talk to other gardeners and you can get seeds from other folks. Because generally people always have more seeds than they need if they already have a garden established. And then in that same vein, pass along plants. Make friends with other gardeners. Everyone always has a plant that does too well in their garden and they're trying to get rid of it or contain it. And so you can trade other gardeners and get plants, get seeds, and get plugs to get established as well. So make friends. And if you want to learn more about Pollinator and about butterfly gardening, about pollinator conservation. These are all organizations that are working to protect butterflies and protect pollinator habitat all throughout either the United States or here just in South Carolina. Sort of across the U.S., we have the Xerxes Society as well as the North American Butterfly Association. Xerxes Society is really focused on pollinator conservation, and the NABA is focused on butterfly gardening and conservation. Both of those groups do really good work. They have a lot of great resources. And so my talk today was really focused here on South Carolina and specifically on the Lowcountry. And that's what I kind of tailored everything to. And so additionally, local groups that are doing the same stuff as the South Carolina Native Plant Society, they're doing a lot of work with native plant conservation. They're doing the native plant sales. They're trying to get native plants into people's hands. And additionally, Carolina Butterfly Society, whose hat I'm wearing here today, we work to conserve the native butterflies of South Carolina. And we lead butterfly walks and do outreach to like this, trying to promote awareness and knowledge about those things. And so please consider joining the Carolina Butterfly Society if you're interested in this kind of thing, if you want to know more, if you want to connect with people working in butterfly conservation or learn more about butterfly gardening, that kind of thing. We're a small group that works in South Carolina and North Carolina trying to promote information about this. So this kind of thing interests you, please consider joining. And additionally, I have materials over here. I have a copy of all of the slides here today, as well as a list of a condensation of all of the plants that I had recommended as well, with all of the individual bullet points lined out, as well as materials about the Butterfly Society. So that's all I got for you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, ma'am. I don't have a slide on that, but I could say frog fruit is a good one. This one here as just a low growing ground cover. But right at the marsh line, as far as things you're going to be able to find readily to grow, there's not a lot. Salt marsh mallow is a good one, but it's kind of more brackish. As well as marsh pinks. They're not great pollinator plants, but they do well in that kind of habitat. I've never seen anyone ever sell them. So there's just not a lot. Oh, and salt marsh aster, again, not one I've ever seen sold, but it does really well, both perennial and annual salt marsh aster. There's sea lavender, and I think that's the only other flowering plants I know of that'll utilize the marsh. Gabe? Oh, sea oxide daisy. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a fantastic one. Yeah, yeah. It doesn't like the salt so much, or the wet. It likes kind of a dry, sandy soil. It'll tolerate salt spray, but I don't think it tolerates salt soil. You can try it. They're very, there's not a lot of risk trying to grow Indian blanket. You can just pick up a packet of seed for $1 or $2, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, then move it a little further in.